Duff Podcasts. A warning, this podcast contains references to subjects and discussions that could be hard for some people to hear, so please take care when you're listening.
Did you have anything like that?
I had nothing like that at school, and I really think if consent had been the base from which I started any kind of exploration, my experience would have been so much different, you know?
Queenie, Queenie, don't drop the ball. Queenie, Queenie, don't drop the ball. Queenie, Queenie, don't drop the ball. Down come baby, cradling on.
Welcome to Tell Me About It, the podcast where we're always finding excuses to talk about sex. I'm Kirsty Johnston.
I'm Michelle Duff.
And I'm Noelle McCarthy.
Yes, I'm excited about this. It's an enthusiastic yes from me. Noelle, this is your guest today. And so what are we talking about?
I love your enthusiastic yes, Michelle. It is very much on topic. Yeah, so I'm bringing the guest today, and she's actually my neighbour. She's my neighbour Lily, and I've really been wanting to interview Lily for ages because I'm constantly having these fascinating chats with her when I see her during the day, because Lily works as a consent educator, which means, as you both know, she goes into schools and she talks to teenagers and teaches them about what yes and no means in the context of intimacy. So that's the sort of polite way of talking about everything from sort of kissing to touching, fingering, sex, whatever, all of that stuff. She educates them about consent in that context.
I'm so glad we're talking about this. I'm so obsessed with how sex fits into our culture in New Zealand, partly because we still seem to be so repressed about it, even though it's like 2022. I'm probably going to blame my, Presbyterian ancestors for that partly. But also because we as reporters see the consequences of not having a good understanding of consent all the time in our work on sexual violence, eh, Michelle?
Yeah, it is at the crux of everything we do, really, eh? When you think about rape culture, which is sort of that, pyramid that goes from someone walking down the street and being wolf whistled at to, someone being violently raped, that's kind of a sliding scale which covers all these little things that behaviours on their own that don't look harmful, but that all kind of serve to trivialise and normalise rape. And that's kind of a lot of the work that we do looks at that, I reckon.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, when you zoom out and you look at all those behaviours, like you say, Michelle, as a macro, because basically all of those things, from getting catcalled to, being violently sexually assaulted, all of these things involve someone doing something to you and your body that you don't want them to do.
Yeah, and that you haven't asked for, a lot of the time. And it's so insidious, and I think that people listening will, identify with this. Some of you maybe, study after study have shown that women have been raped and don't even perceive it that way at the time. It's an experience that women put down to just being bad sex.
I think we can identify. I mean, that's a whole other episode, isn't it? Was it just bad sex, or was it an assault? I think we're probably not going to solve that today. We're definitely not going to solve.
Are we not?
No, unfortunately, we're not going to solve that in the next 30 minutes. But I think we probably need to circle back around to this. And I think we probably need to hear more from our listeners as well. So if you have a story and you want to hear an episode about this, about sort of bad sex and where it sits on the continuum of assault, you can DM us on our Tell Me About It Instagram, which is @TellMeAboutItNZ. We'd love to hear from you.
I think, coming back to consent, the major reason it's still a problem is both because, the general societal, conditions that Michelle was talking about, but also because kids aren't really taught about it in any consistent or meaningful way. It's not like in Australia where they're about to make consent education compulsory. I mean, I think when I was at school, we didn't even learn about consent at all. We just kind of had this one weird house teacher that talked to us a lot about masturbation, if I remember rightly.
totally agree. Like, I went to Catholic school, and what we were taught was about the sacred union of man and wife. Like, that was about the size of it. I think I was about 35 when I got a grasp on sort of, not only that consent is a needful and necessary thing, but also the intricacies of it, like that you can consent to one thing but not another. You can revoke your consent at any times, that you can and should, both partners should be looking for that. Like, it wasn't part of my upbringing at all. I didn't know anything about it. What about you, Michelle?
I mean, just listening to that, it's so sad and frustrating that you would have to be, in your mid-30s before you, are able to reflect back on that and sort of fully understand what consent means. What I really would have liked to have known when I was a teenager is that I didn't have to go along with things that I didn't like just because it felt too hard to say no.
Totally.
I had so many bad sexual experiences that in hindsight, a lot of them I didn't consent to. And, I'd like to think that's changed now, but has it?
Do you know, I think, and this is what makes me sad, I hope we're not going to be like totally sad this whole episode and just sort of weeping for our adolescences. But, I feel no one in my friend group, none of us even expected the experiences to be good. Like, there was no sense that you were looking forward to a fun time or that you'd have an orgasm or anything like that. There was no pleasure sort of anticipated, which feels so bloody sad in retrospect.
I mean, I did have one friend who told me in great detail how to have an orgasm when I was about 16, and I really appreciated that. I feel like that was kind of one out of the box, though.
Yeah, that definitely wasn't my experience. It was like, oh, you went out with him? Oh, did you get, like, where did you get to? Did you get to first base? Did you get to second base? Like, I don't know.
Hang on, what are the bases? I never could. This gives me an awful lot of anxiety because I think everyone's bases are different. And if you're sort of, working from 1 to 4, can you clarify, Kirsty? Like, what were the bases?
I really can't. I mean, I've just, where's dry humping on the spectrum? I don't know.
Would it be mutual masturbation?
Can you not use that term?
I'm sorry. I know. I hate it, but it just really brings that that mental image. Anyway, moving on.
It takes a lot of the magic out of it.
Talk about.
Sorry. Anyway, yeah.
People didn't talk about bases where I was from, but I think that was just because everyone went straight to fourth.
Is fourth the full show, the whole thing?
Yes, Noelle. That's the home run.
Glad we've got that.
Anyway, one thing I'm really interested in, to be honest, though, is what Lily is going to say about porn, like how that has changed sex and like expectations around sex. I mean, what you have access to now is so hardcore. All these kids see is like violent, degrading sex with choking and like incest. I mean, like, I'm not even joking. The most searched thing on Pornhub, I think last year, was like step sibling porn. I
just can't even. What? I didn't even know that was a thing that you could search on the internet. Yeah,
it's weird.
Like sheltered from fielding rights.
Totally. Like vanilla sex, like all the way. Jeez. What we had to contend with when we were teenagers is just nothing like that, eh? We literally had like Playboy mags and MSN Messenger. That's it. Yeah, the environment that young kids, listen to me, I'm ancient. Teenagers now is just so much more complex. And yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just interested in our society in general. It's got such a permissive attitude towards rape. So how's sex education, like consent education, going to be able to change it?
That's a good question. All right. So I interviewed Lily, and the night before I interviewed Lily, I watched Euphoria for the first time. So I was pretty shook. I mean, talking about nudes, I think there's a line in the in episode 1 of Euphoria where they talk about nudes being your currency, like your sexual currency, the thing you exchange. And So that was very much in the front of my mind when I was talking to Lily. So she teaches a consent program, right, that runs for 5 to 6 weeks in schools. And it starts for 13-year-olds. And she was saying to me that, like, the best case scenario is that schools would run this program from year 9 to year 13 for each class and build on it every year. But Lily was saying that doesn't actually often happen because of timetabling clashes and constraints that the school has. So basically what she ends up doing is mostly teaching years 9, 10, and sometimes year 11. And what we talked about, you're going to hear her talking about what it's like talking to a bunch of teenagers you've never met before about sex and consent and the challenges of that and the bits of that are magic. And also, and I think this is the gold, right, what she's hearing from teenagers, what they're worried about, all of their questions. And that's the bit that's really eye-opening. Lily is super thoughtful about how she does this work. So I started off by asking her if she can assume that the kids she's meeting for every course, you know, when she starts teaching the consent course, know anything about consent to begin with, and also what the atmosphere is like when you're getting started with the course. So here's Lily, and she's talking about teaching consent to teenagers in schools.
Each school is quite different, which is interesting, but there have been classes where the majority of students haven't heard of the term consent. Yeah, it really varies, and there's always there are sort of trends that emerge in schools and in different years and in different classes. And I think it's really important to sort of remain open to those, and that's where we get lots of growth and important conversation.
So what sort of trends?
Trends like harmful behaviours, which might be self-harm, suicide, ideation, anxiety, how to deal with that, or it might be about anal sex or, you know, things that pertain specifically to their sexual experiences.
Interesting. So all of this stuff is sort of the atmosphere in which you're coming in, and that can change from time to time, but sometimes you'll go into somewhere new and you don't know what the atmosphere is going to be before you start.
Definitely, all the time. You just don't know what the atmosphere is going to be, and it's always awkward. Like, walking in, the kids generally think it's sex ed, and you walk in and they're kind of resistant, although desperate as well to talk about it. But the first session is always really awkward, and you're trying to check the vibe, and you know, the atmosphere is, I guess, I don't know, they're kind of resisting giving too much to you. But, you know, I try to facilitate rather than teaching or delivering exactly, to try and form relationships with the kids, and thereby the atmosphere grows, and we can, you know, it does grow and it gets better as the course goes on.
So if you're in front of a class of 13-year-olds who may not ever have heard of consent before, how do you explain it?
Well, I mean, it's not tricky, but it's always horrifying to be confronted with that, because these are kids who obviously have they often don't have relationships with any kind of responsible adult, you know, the parent, caregiver, teacher, you know, they're completely bereft of these important relationships. How do I explain it? It's knowing what you want and how to ask for it, and also how to find out what others want. And we talk about it specifically within situations of intimacy, basically how to make sure you're doing the right thing and that both parties are enthusiastic and engaged.
I'm just thinking, I never had anything like that at school. Did you have anything like that?
I had nothing like that at school, and I really think if consent had been the base from which I started any kind of exploration, my experience would have been so much different, you know?
And broadly speaking, I know every class would be different and every school is different, but are the teenagers that you work with, when you introduce this concept of sort of enthusiastic consent, are they surprised, or are they excited by the idea, or are they intimidated by it, or what are the responses like?
I think in part, like, theoretically, philosophically they're totally onto it, they're up with it. Teenagers these days, they're really woke, they're capable of discussing these kinds of concepts. But realistically and practically speaking, I think it is quite intimidating to understand what that means and how to do it.
So do you get technical? Like, do you talk about kissing and touching? And
Yeah, I get so technical.
how do you do it? Do you have I think the banana is the one that lots of people
that's
remember.
what everyone's
puppets.
desperate for. They want the banana, but I don't give the banana. I don't do the banana.
You don't bring a banana.
Nah, because it's not sex ed, it's about consent and healthy relationships. But where it gets technical is we have an anonymous question box where they can ask an anonymous question, and they ask it at the end of one class, and then I'll go and think about research, find out the answers, and come back and present them at the start of the next class. And that's where all the questions about sort of the intricacies of intimacy come out, and that's where we get technical. And it can be as basic as how do I ask someone if I want to kiss them, to any manner of things further on than that.
Do they ask you if things are okay? Do they check things out?
They ask, sometimes they ask, is it okay to ask my partner if she wants to have sex, for example? Or is it okay to make a comment about my girlfriend's ass? Or is it okay to give someone a compliment about their body when I'm asking them out? They're asking.
It's a lot of responsibility for you, is it? You're looking at this little pile of Post-its or whatever it is.
It is in a way, but really I just try and facilitate conversation. So it all comes back to a big part of what I try and do is teach them how to communicate respectfully to each other, and with themselves, really. And, it comes back to being respectful and communicating assertively. So then asking them, how would you address this? What do we think about this? I mean, you have to be careful because obviously they're not trauma informed, or you have to be really careful that they're not going to be body shaming or victim blaming in their conversations. But again, that's sort of part of the facilitation.
Wow, you have to be pretty deft. So you have to be a few steps ahead in terms of seeing where something could go.
Yeah, I think you can get a feeling pretty quickly in a class that might have something of a rape culture thriving. I think you get...
what's that like? I mean, how do you assess that? How do you know?
Because when you walk in, they're making stupid jokes about consent or rape, or, it's this so-called locker room chit-chat that's actually, is harmful.
Is this boys' schools? Or?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Because you do it in lots of different schools, I
do it in all types of schools, and it's quite different between the single sex and the co-ed, yeah.
What about, you talked about that atmosphere, what about porn? Because, we hear so much about the sort of pornification of culture and how that's affecting how young people in particular are sexually active. What do you think?
I think it definitely is affecting some young people and how they're sexually active, and I think it's doing something to affect the culture of sex and sexuality. But I don't think it's probably as pervasive as we who are not of that generation think. I think it's important.
It's kind of terrifying. Yeah,
about it.
If you didn't grow up with it. I mean, I look at that now, and even watching, an episode of Euphoria or something, and thinking, shit, women are really being objectified in a way that, but maybe we were always being objectified in different ways. I don't know. When you talk about rape culture in classrooms, is that part of it? Is that sort of porn aesthetic or expectations?
Yeah, I think
of sex?
so. I think in a way it is. There is a hyper femininity and hyper masculinity that's presented in most mainstream porn, and those kinds of stereotypes are really dangerous when we're thinking about consent, because people might have an expectation of what someone will do because of the way they look, or they might have an expectation of where things will naturally go because of something they're doing, from watching porn. A lot of the situations that they're watching are non-consensual. Often it's, they're really heteronormative, and it's often the man who's in a control of seeking pleasure and
getting it,
and usually not wearing a condom. And the woman's role is usually, being demeaned in some way. So also they present this really unrealistic body image. And so but it's important to be realistic. They're watching porn. So, I talk about just having this awareness that it's not imitating reality, it's not a realistic indication of what to expect.
Again, generalizing, are there different challenges you think for different genders? Is it a different challenge to grasp certain concepts or enact certain concepts for boys and for girls, and a different challenge again for kids who identify as non-binary? Is this stuff gendered?
Yeah, I think there are definitely different challenges, just from what I've seen in the classroom and the kinds of things that we talk about, the kinds of questions I get. The girls are often centred around social interactions, concerns about that, anxieties about whether they're, doing the right thing, making the right moves, whether they can get with so-and-so because they were with someone else before, all of that kind of, that horrible social stuff that I remember. And it gets pretty toxic, and there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of worry about the impact that they're having within their relationships, their friend relationships. And then with boys, they're still mainly concerned about their dick size.
Oh, bless, that hasn't changed. Do you get that in the questions?
We get it just constantly. Just
really?
Always like, is it too big? Is it too little? Why isn't it growing? Is it too crooked or not crooked enough? Or, why don't I have erections? Or why do I always have erections? Why does it hurt? What is
Yeah.
all of it?
Just all of it. All of it. Relating to that area. Oh, wow. Yeah. So that's sort of physical stuff. Because it feels like you're sort of at the coalface, a lot of work around sexual violence and intimate partner violence in New Zealand. The what's coming out of that is the realization that, we need to focus on boys in the culture, and we need to focus on getting the right message about consent, making sure that that's understood. Do you feel like that's happening? Do you think that is coming through?
Yeah, I think there needs to be quite a bit more work around that. I think the consent program that I facilitate is, although we talk about consent in a general term, and consent is the same for anyone, no matter who they are or what situation they're in. I think the program can quickly become quite heteronormative, and then there's a misconception that it's always boys predating on girls.
Yeah.
And whilst the statistics do support that largely, I don't think it's a helpful discussion really. I think I have noticed quite a bit of kickback in boys' schools. Not all men, not
Is that
all men.
what do they say to you?
They, there's an indignation, there's a sense of like righteousness, and they might, you were saying, what's it like walking into a classroom? In some classes, when I walk in, they, that's the first thing they want to tell me is how the law is stacked against them, and I find it really hard to accommodate that.
What do they mean, the law? Like,
I don't know, they want to give me teen scenarios about how, what if this and what if that?
What if I have sex with someone and then the next
day
that sort of
she
thing.
decides that it wasn't consensual, But obviously, I'm I'm not going to get into individual scenarios like that, but so it comes back to consent,
Do you get pushback against the idea of consent ever, or really strong misconceptions about it?
I think the idea of consent, not so much, but maybe like the law, like they really want to pick the law apart, and the idea around drinking, whether you can give consent when you can't give consent when you're drunk or, impaired by drugs or alcohol. But again, does
that render a lot of the work that you're doing sort of problematic anyway, or theoretical?
Yeah, I think so. I think it does, which is why I take a harm reduction approach. Like, we know they're drinking, we know they're accessing illegal porn, we all know that they're sending nudes, all of the stuff which is illegal by definition of law, but it's still happening. So we talk a lot about how to recognise, how drunk you are when you're too drunk, and we talk a lot about bystander intervention. How to be a good friend, or even doesn't even have to be a friend. How to act when you see something, when things go wrong,
and look out for each other.
Yeah. I always like to let them know that, sex or any kind of intimacy in relationships is the most enjoyable, the more connected you are, when you're conscious, when you're aware, when you're both there, you're both communicating, consent is sexy. That's when you have a really good time.
So that's Lily, my neighbour in the Wairarapa, and also a consent educator. Consent is sexy. Do you think that message has much of a hope of getting through, or what do you think, having listened to Lily? What did you think, Michelle?
So one of my biggest fears is that my sons will be rapists. Okay, it is actually something that keeps me up at night. And I am a feminist, and I try and reiterate to them the importance of consent, even in small things, right? Like, asking before they touch someone, or whatever it is. But I feel like it doesn't really matter. And at some point, it doesn't really matter what I say and do. If there's a whole bunch of boys who are sort of egging each other on and joking about, having sex with drunk women and that kind of thing, how much can you even do as a parent?
I think you can do a lot, I think you can do a lot, because you're the one who I'm not just trying to reassure you, because my heart goes out to you when you say that. I'm like, oh my God, that's such a visceral fear. But I think you can, because I think that's where we learn our first lessons, isn't it? And I'm not saying peer pressure isn't a real thing, but I think if you've been brought up to respect and value women and relationships and consent and all those things, it's harder to get dragged along, isn't it?
I think one of the most important things she was saying she teaches about the bystander intervention, because I wrote a piece last year about boys and like the messages they absorb and stuff. And one of the really interesting things the researchers were telling me about was how like lots of men, and maybe boys, assume that other men think in this way that's like derogatory towards women. So if one of their mates makes like a dodgy joke, none of them be like, bro, that's not cool, because they assume all the other guys in the group also think it's funny. But it's not true. Like, most of them are also thinking, God, that was off colour. So I feel like if you, Michelle, or like Lily or someone can get them to say that's not cool, that's like a massive change.
Do you know what's quite interesting is, how a lot of times where there's, someone will have been raped and someone will be like, well, why didn't you just say no? Saying no is actually a really hard thing to do socially.
Look, I guess one more thing to bring up, that like, she's only in there for 5 weeks. This is not an ongoing thing in New Zealand schools, right? And it's totally up to the schools at the moment. It's not like you were talking about Australia, Kirsty, where it's now going to be compulsory to have this education, but this isn't happening here, right?
No, I think like even sex education, not consent education, is just like so variable in New Zealand, because it's all down to like what an individual school chooses to do. And they're supposed to survey like every 2 years from their community and blah, blah, blah. But I think, everyone knows that that's not an ideal situation. So, yeah, ideally we would get something more rigorous, I guess, and hopefully that would address some of these issues.
Fingers bloody crossed. Yeah, thank you both. We'll be back next week, probably not talking about sex, probably talking about something slightly different, but we are going to keep talking about these issues. So if you've got something
we are talking
yeah,
about
of course we are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do we say thank you to Lily?
I said thank you very briefly, but I think she'd appreciate your thanks as well. So yeah, thanks to Lily.
Maybe you just drop some muffins over the fence or something. I mean, I'm sure you've got heaps of time to just do a bit of baking, do you, Noelle?
Just whip up a batch of muffins. She actually makes a great banana cake herself, so the bar is set very high. She makes an excellent banana cake and an excellent sort of plum cake. So I might just have to buy her some expensive chocolate or something. I can't compete. Thank you, Lily. Thanks for being a great neighbour and a great educator. We'll see you next week.
See you all next week.
Ka kite.
Tell Me About It is made for Stuff by Bird of Paradise Productions. It was produced by me, Noelle McCarthy, and written by me, Kirsty Johnston, and Michelle Duff. Our script supervisor is Eugene Bingham, and thanks to Janine Fenwick and Eugene for editorial oversight. Mixed by Mark Chesterman. And our theme tune is Queenie Queenie by Tammy Nielsen, our queen. You can like the podcast and leave a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tell Me About It is made possible by funding from New Zealand On Air.
Queenie, Queenie, don't drop the ball. Queenie, Queenie, don't drop the ball. Queenie, Queenie, don't drop the ball. Down come baby, cradling on. Queenie.